The term Project Monarch is not listed as an official program name in declassified records released by the CIA, and is used here to describe allegations and historical discussions linked to Cold War psychological research. During the early Cold War period, particularly from the late 1940s through the early 1970s, intelligence agencies in the United States and allied nations expanded research into human cognition, stress response, memory, and behavioral control, driven by concerns surrounding espionage, interrogation resistance, defection, and psychological warfare. And this expansion occurred alongside broader geopolitical tensions following World War II, including the emergence of the Soviet Union as a rival power, and reports that adversarial states were conducting their own experiments in brainwashing and coercive persuasion. Within this context, the Central Intelligence Agency initiated and funded a series of classified research efforts, later acknowledged publicly under program names such as Bluebird, Artichoke, and MKULT-RO, which explored hypnosis, pharmacological substances, sensory deprivation, isolation, and psychological stress. And although the stated goals of these programs varied over time, internal memoranda consistently referenced the need to understand how the human mind responds under extreme or controlled conditions, particularly when ordinary reference points, such as time, identity, and social contact are disrupted. Discussions commonly labeled as Project Monarch are generally linked to alleged research into dissociation, a psychological phenomenon in which the mind separates or compartmentalizes experience as a response to overwhelming stress. And this phenomenon was not invented by intelligence agencies, but had been documented in clinical and military contexts prior to the Cold War, including in studies of combat trauma and captivity. And according to later accounts, dissociation was allegedly examined for its potential relevance to interrogation, resistance training, and information control, though surviving documentation does not confirm a distinct program operating under the Monarch name. The label Monarch itself is most often associated with symbolic language rather than administrative terminology, frequently referencing the monarch butterfly and its process of metamorphosis as a metaphor for psychological fragmentation and restructuring. And while this symbolism appears frequently in survivor testimony, therapeutic literature, and later cultural analysis, it does not appear explicitly in declassified CIA program files, suggesting that the term emerged outside formal record-keeping rather than within it. During the 1950s and 1960s, behavioral research connected to intelligence objectives was conducted at universities, military hospitals, and research institutes across the United States, Canada, and parts of Europe, often through indirect funding arrangements designed to obscure the involvement of intelligence agencies. And while many of these studies focused on stress tolerance, learning, and perception, the incomplete nature of the archival record makes it difficult to determine how specific findings were applied operationally, particularly after it was revealed that a substantial portion of MKUltra documentation was destroyed in 1973 under orders issued by then CIA Director Richard Helms. As a result of those destroyed records, later investigations, including congressional inquiries and Freedom of Information Act releases, were able to confirm the existence of unethical experimentation, but were unable to reconstruct the full scope of methods, sub-projects, or outcomes. And it is within these archival gaps that Project Monarch is most often discussed, not as a single documented program, but as a term used to describe alleged extensions or interpretations of confirmed Cold War psychological research. Official statements from intelligence agencies have consistently denied the existence of any program matching the more extreme claims associated with Project Monarch, while acknowledging that past experimentation violated ethical standards, and this contrast between confirmed misconduct and incomplete documentation has contributed to ongoing debate, investigation, and speculation, which continues decades after the original programs were terminated. This recording does not attempt to resolve those debates or reach conclusions, but proceeds by outlining the historical setting, the acknowledged programs, and the context in which the Monarch label later appeared, allowing the material to be heard as background, without emphasis or urgency, as the language remains steady and administrative, and the reading continues without signaling resolution or transition. Discussions commonly labeled as Project Monarch often focus on alleged mechanisms related to dissociation and compartmentalization, concepts that were already present in psychological and psychiatric literature prior to the Cold War, particularly in studies of trauma, captivity, and combat stress. And dissociation is generally defined as a mental process in which perception, memory, or identity becomes divided as a response to overwhelming experience, allowing the individual to continue functioning while isolating distressing material from conscious awareness. During the mid-20th century, dissociation was documented in clinical cases involving prisoners of war, survivors of severe abuse, and individuals exposed to prolonged stress. And military and intelligence researchers were aware of these findings through both domestic research and translated foreign studies, particularly those examining the effects of isolation, interrogation, and coercive environments. And within Cold War intelligence contexts, such psychological responses were allegedly examined for their relevance to interrogation resistance, memory suppression, and behavioral compliance. Allegations associated with Project Monarch frequently describe dissociation not as a spontaneous outcome, but as a condition that could be deliberately intensified through controlled environments, prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, and psychological stress. Methods that were confirmed to have been explored under programs such as MK-Ultra. And according to these accounts, repeated exposure to such conditions was believed to increase compartmentalization, allowing different memory states or behavioral responses to exist without conscious integration. Clinical language from the period often referred to regression, dependency, and suggestibility as predictable outcomes of sustained uncertainty, and these terms appear throughout declassified Cold War-era documents, describing how individuals deprived of stable reference points may revert to earlier coping strategies or become increasingly responsive to external cues, and in alleged monarch-related discussions, these effects are interpreted as foundational to creating compartmentalized mental states, though no surviving documents explicitly describe such applications in operational detail. Another frequently cited element involves conditioning, a concept drawn from established behavioral psychology, in which repeated associations between stimuli and responses gradually shape behavior. And while conditioning itself is not controversial, allegations surrounding Project Monarch suggest that conditioning was applied in conjunction with dissociative states, theoretically allowing specific cues, such as words, sounds, or contextual changes, to activate isolated memory or behavioral responses. Though it must be noted that these claims are primarily supported by survivor testimony and later interpretation rather than corroborated operational manuals. Symbolic language is also commonly associated with these discussions, particularly the use of the monarch butterfly as a metaphor for transformation and internal division. And while symbolism was widely used in psychological theory and therapeutic practice, direct evidence of its formal use within intelligence training materials has not been released. suggesting that symbolic frameworks may have been applied informally or retrospectively rather than codified administratively. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, intelligence-funded psychological research often blurred the boundary between academic study and operational application, as universities, hospitals, and private researchers conducted experiments under classified or partially classified contracts. And while many studies focused on learning, perception, and stress tolerance, later investigations revealed that informed consent was frequently absent and ethical oversight minimal by modern standards. The destruction of a significant portion of MKULTRA-related records in 1973 has made it difficult to determine how experimental findings were interpreted or applied beyond their stated research goals. And as a result, later claims regarding dissociation-based control remain difficult to verify or falsify conclusively, existing primarily within the space between confirmed experimentation and missing documentation. Within this context, Project Monarch is best understood not as a documented program, but as a conceptual label applied to alleged practices that draw upon known psychological phenomena, confirmed unethical experimentation, and incomplete archives. And this recording does not assert the effectiveness, scope, or operational reality of such practices, but simply outlines the mechanisms most frequently referenced in discussions surrounding the term. The language remains neutral and procedural, without emphasis or conclusion. And as the reading continues, there is no requirement to judge, analyze, or retain the material, allowing the words to remain present only as background sound, steady and unchanging, as the discussion moves forward without resolution or pause. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, psychological research connected to intelligence objectives was no longer confined to a single office or laboratory, but distributed across a network of government agencies, military departments, academic institutions, medical facilities, and private contractors, with coordination reportedly centered around administrative hubs in the United States, while operational work occurred across multiple domestic and overseas locations. And declassified records confirm that the CIA utilized indirect funding mechanisms to support research projects through front organizations, grants, and intermediary institutions, allowing studies to proceed without clear attribution to intelligence sponsorship. Universities in states such as New York, California, Massachusetts, and Illinois are documented as having hosted government-funded psychological research during this period, often focused on stress, cognition, perception, learning, and memory. And while the majority of these studies were presented publicly as academic research, later investigations revealed that some were conducted under classified contracts or with undisclosed intelligence involvement, creating a blurred boundary between civilian science and covert application. And this structure allowed findings to circulate widely within professional circles while remaining partially shielded from public scrutiny. In addition to academic environments, military hospitals and research centers played a significant role, particularly facilities associated with the United States Army and Navy, where studies involving isolation, sensory deprivation, sleep disruption, and interrogation resistance were conducted on soldiers, volunteers, and in some cases unwitting participants. And declassified memoranda indicate that data from these settings was shared across agencies, contributing to a growing body of institutional knowledge regarding human response to controlled stress. Overseas, intelligence and allied facilities operating in post-war Europe and East Asia are frequently referenced in Cold War documentation, including locations in West Germany, Japan, South Korea, and later Southeast Asia, where interrogation and counterintelligence operations were conducted in parallel with ongoing research, and while specific case files remain classified or destroyed. These regions appear repeatedly in administrative correspondence discussing field application, personnel rotation, and procedural consistency, suggesting that psychological frameworks developed domestically were tested or observed abroad. Private contractors and consultants also appear throughout the historical record, including psychiatrists, psychologists, and behavioral scientists who moved between academic posts, government advisory roles, and classified projects, sometimes without full visibility into how their research would be used. And this circulation of expertise contributed to the diffusion of psychological concepts such as dissociation, conditioning, and regression beyond any single program, embedding them within a broader institutional culture rather than isolating them to a named project. Within discussions labeled as Project Monarch, this diffusion is often cited as evidence that techniques associated with trauma-based dissociation could persist even without a centralized program. As knowledge continued to circulate through training manuals, professional conferences, classified briefings, and interagency collaboration, and while no surviving documents confirm coordinated implementation under the Monarch name, the decentralized nature of Cold War research infrastructure makes definitive boundaries difficult to establish. Following the public exposure of MK-Ultra and related programs in the 1970s, many intelligence agencies revised oversight structures, terminated certain research lines, and implemented formal ethics guidelines. Yet documentation indicates that not all practices were immediately abandoned, and some methodologies were reclassified, renamed, or absorbed into broader behavioral science and training frameworks, complicating later attempts to trace continuity or termination. As a result, Project Monarch is often discussed not as a discrete historical event, but as an interpretive lens applied to a networked system of institutions, locations, and professionals operating across decades. And this recording does not assert coordination, intent, or outcome, but situates the allegations within the known structure of Cold War research and intelligence operations, allowing the material to remain descriptive rather than conclusive, steady rather than dramatic, and suitable for passive listening as the words continue without emphasis, transition, or resolution. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, public exposure of Cold War psychological research altered how intelligence agencies discussed behavioral experimentation as congressional inquiries, media reporting, and civil litigation brought previously classified activities into public view. And although programs such as MK-Ultra were officially terminated and acknowledged as unethical, the language used to describe psychological influence, conditioning, and stress response did not disappear, but instead shifted into broader academic, military, and clinical contexts, where similar concepts continued to be studied under different names and ethical frameworks. During this period, survivor testimony began to circulate more widely, particularly through therapy settings, legal proceedings, and later independent publications. And many of these accounts used descriptive language to explain experiences of fragmentation, memory compartmentalization, and conditioned response, often drawing on symbolic frameworks to communicate internal states that were difficult to describe clinically. And it is within this environment that the term Project Monarch gained traction, functioning less as an administrative label and more as a narrative shorthand used to connect personal experience to a historical backdrop of confirmed experimentation and missing documentation. The persistence of the monarch label is also closely tied to the destruction of records acknowledged in 1973, which created permanent gaps in the archival record and limited the ability of investigators to reconstruct specific methodologies, timelines, or outcomes, and in the absence of complete documentation.
Interpretation filled the space where files no longer existed, allowing patterns to be inferred rather than confirmed, and this ambiguity contributed to ongoing debate rather than resolution.
Cultural diffusion further reinforced the label as themes associated with dissociation, conditioning, and identity fragmentation appeared in films, literature, and later digital media, often borrowing symbolic elements without reference to original sources, and over time these representations fed back into public understanding, blurring the boundary between documented history, personal testimony, and fictionalized interpretation, making the term Project Monarch increasingly detached from any single historical claim and more representative of a broader anxiety surrounding psychological control and institutional secrecy. Official statements from intelligence agencies have consistently maintained that no program titled Project Monarch existed, while acknowledging that past research violated ethical standards and oversight. And this dual position has left space for continued speculation without formal confirmation, ensuring that the discussion remains unresolved by design rather than by evidence alone. And as decades passed, the monarch label persisted largely because it addressed unanswered questions rather than documented facts.
Within this context, Project Monarch is best understood not as a closed historical case, but as a term that emerged at the intersection of confirmed Cold War experimentation, destroyed records, survivor narratives, and cultural reinterpretation. And this recording does not seek to affirm or dismiss those narratives, but situates them within a historical pattern in which secrecy, partial disclosure, and institutional language shaped public understanding long after the original programs ended. As the reading continues, there is no conclusion announced and no resolution offered, only the acknowledgement that discussions surrounding Project Monarch remain open-ended, shaped by what is known, what is missing, and how language evolves over time. And the tone remains neutral and administrative, allowing the material to remain present, without urgency, judgment, or instruction, suitable for passive listening as attention softens and the words gradually recede into the background.